In 1998 in New York City, Manchester band The Fall played what was quite possibly the worst gig by a British band in all of human history, self-destructing on stage with a massive brawl that resulted in the entire band quitting afterwards and lead singer Marc Smith getting arrested by the NYPD. But to understand why that all happened, you also need to understand the story leading up to that night. You need to know the big picture and what the frontman of the band, Marc Smith, had put the rest of the band through for many years. In 1976 in Manchester, Marc E. Smith was a poet, one of 4 friends who would meet to read their writings to one another and to get stoned. That same year, after seeing the Sex Pistols perform live at the Lesser Free Trade Hall, the 4 of them decided to turn their collective into a band, which they would name The Fall. In the earliest days, everyone in the band was equal. It was a democracy. Una Baines, who was the keyboard player at that time, was also in a relationship with Marc Smith. And as The Fall began to build a fan base and get bigger and better gigs, she noticed that the dynamic had started to shift.
Originally, I felt, and I think everybody else would agree with this, that we were just all equal members of a band. I think as The Fall evolved, it emerged as Marc as very definitely, the voice of The Fall.
It seems that right from the beginning, Marc E. Smith had discovered that having his girlfriend in the band worked in his favour when it came to the power dynamic. Because, whoever she was, she would more often than not take his side in any given dispute, choosing to back him up rather than jeopardise the relationship. And that pattern would last right from the earliest days of The Fall throughout the 40+ years it existed. However, Marc and Una did split, and Marc began dating a new girl called Kay. And, against the wishes of most of the band, once again she was absorbed into the operation, being made the band manager.
And at that time me and Marc were drifting apart, we were splitting up really, and they got together and she became The Fall's manager.
What, somebody, what you talking about? You're pirating my bloody stuff, Tony. What you talking about? He's being an arsehole and he's calling me, you know what I mean?
The idea of a manager seemed to be against the original ethos of The Fall, so that was a bit problematic. And Tony left. I left. And then a whole new Fall emerged.
And thus began the endless churn of band members that The Fall would become known for, with Marc Smith, the man at the top, being the only constant member throughout. By the time The Fall released their debut album, Live at the Witch Trials, they'd already burned through 2 drummers. And then, in April 1979, the last of the original members, guitarist Martin Brammer, quit the band, saying, "What initially started out as a collective became a dictatorship, dominated by Smith." One of the many replacement musicians joined in June 1978, now famous DJ Marc Riley, who had started out as a roadie for the band.
I remember once we went to record Live at the Witch Trials, and we ended up recording the album in a day. So we were wandering around London, particularly Martin, Carl and I remember saying to me, "You're Mark's puppet, aren't you?" And I'm like, "What?" And they're saying, "Yeah, you'll do anything that he tells you, that's why he got you in, we wanted our mate." And I'm going, "Oh, I'm sorry, but what can I do?" I think they were the seeds of the split in the band and it becoming not a load of mates all pulling together and working together, but Marc wanting to foist his own kind of intentions on everybody else.
Unfortunately, Marc Smith didn't seem able to get along with anyone long term, even those considered his lackeys and his yes men. By the time the band were recording Slates, their second EP in 1981, Marc had begun venting his dislike and distrust of other band members passive-aggressively through his song lyrics. He'd written a song called Older Lover about his older girlfriend, manager Kay, and on a song called Middle Mass, Marc Riley had started to notice that he was now being targeted in the lyrics as well. Smith denied it, of course, but it was clear that things were now becoming strained between Smith and his so-called puppet, who, it turned out, was the band member most willing to confront and stand up to him. By mid-1982, the passive aggression from Mark E. Smith towards Marc Riley had begun to manifest in more obvious ways. While they were recording their fifth album, Room to Live, bassist Steve Hanley had this conversation with Marc Riley. Riley said, "Haven't you noticed that at every sound check and most rehearsals, my guitar's too loud, or it's out of time, or the keyboards don't sound right? Tracy is getting crossed off the guest lists, and you're telling me it's nothing personal?" He's talking about his girlfriend. They've been seeing each other a few months, and the last time we played in Manchester, she couldn't get in. Marc Riley had checked the guest list afterwards, and Tracy's name had been scribbled out in Mark Smith's distinctive scrawl. As time went by, Mark E. Smith's manner seemed to keep deteriorating further and further.
Most of the time we just got on with it and pretty much did as we were told, didn't we?
Yeah. At the beginning, yeah.
At the beginning.
Yeah, fucking pull the monitors off, for Christ's sake!
Like a matter of life or death, the fall gig, wasn't it?
Yeah.
There was,
You couldn't be seen to enjoy yourself, could you?
no.
Shortly after making Room to Live, the band flew to Sydney, Australia to perform. Booked to play in what turned out to be a massive pub, the band had quite a bit to drink before going on stage, and Mark E. Smith rolled up late, arriving at the venue after they were already due on stage. All these things combined to make it a pretty rubbish gig. The band, heavily jet-lagged and slightly tipsy, struggled to concentrate and play properly all throughout. After the gig, the rest of the band went to a nightclub to let off steam, but Mark E. Smith tracked them down there and crossed the next red line. We stormed the empty dance floor, throwing shapes to rock the Casbah, but by the time we were into the second verse, one by one my bandmates gradually stopped dancing. A skeletal hand grabs my shoulder and twists me round. Crikey, it's Mark Smith and he is seething. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he yells. He reaches up to give our Paul, the drummer, a slap on the face. Having captured our attention, Mark turns on the rest of us. "You're not too tired to dance," he screams and slaps me next. Next up, it's Craig. Craig's response is to slowly rub his cheek and give Mark a withering look. But Mark's really getting into it now. "You were too fucking tired to play a decent gig." With that, he finishes by going for Marc Riley. Only Marc Riley's not having it. He follows our singer off the dance floor to where Kay is standing, and so do we, just in time to witness Mark Smith roll up his sleeves and throw out a limp thump towards Marc Riley, who retaliates by promptly flooring him with a full-blown punch. "Help, help, I'm being attacked," screams Mark at the entire nightclub. Thank fuck it's mostly empty. Muttering obscenities, he steams off into the night. By this time, the Fall had split into two clear factions. On one side you had Mark and Kay, the singer and the manager, who were dating. Every other member of the band was on the other side. None of them were spending any time socially with Mark Smith anymore. And every time one of them got married, the rest of the band was always invited and Mark E. Smith was always not. It was in fact literally on the day of bass player Steve Hanley's wedding that Mark E. Smith called the wedding party, to which he was not invited, and demanded to speak to Marc Riley. The various verbal and physical disagreements between Mark and Mark on tour have been well documented. It became increasingly clear that something would have to give, and to no one's real surprise, Marc Riley was sacked over the phone in December 1982.
My relationship with Mark Smith started off brilliantly and ended not so brilliantly, really.
Well, he wanted to do the hits every night, I stopped the group.
He said, "We're going to Europe in about a month." I went, "All right, okay." He said, "But I don't want you to come." He said, "If you don't go very well, we'll call you when we get back and you can rejoin the band." And I'm like, "Right, okay." I've still had the phone call.
In 1983, the Fall were on tour in America, and manager Kay was also about to reach the end of her time with the band and her boyfriend.
Listen, you and Ellen Erasmus, right, was you know what was going on. I got you out of all that shit with that idiot we had, right?
She had ruled the band with an utterly domineering personality and an iron fist, and once she'd gone, Mark E. Smith fully took up that mantle alone, now ascending to become the sole controlling power over the entire band. And one of the first things he did when they got to Canada was a perverse exercise of that power over the rest of the musicians who were very hungry after travelling and hadn't eaten before going on stage. Bass player Steve Hanley tells the story. "Where's the food, Sol?" I ask our driver. "Why didn't you come to dinner before the gig?" he asks. "There was only me and Mark sat at a big fucking table." "Are you telling me there was a meal laid on at the hotel for the band and Mark didn't tell us about it?" The crumbling look on his face is all the confirmation I need, and I'm livid. No one said anything to any of us about the dinner. I'm beginning to see what's going on here. Kay's only been gone a day, and Mark's already playing the dictator. Kay being gone meant that Mark didn't have a girlfriend in the band with whom to consolidate his power. But that didn't last for very long. Because literally out on that same tour, he found his next girlfriend in LA. Apparently, within 3 months of meeting her, Mark E. Smith had already invited Brix into the band on guitar and married her. It didn't take long at all, however, for the honeymoon period to be over. He continued writing songs attacking members of the band, and by now he had moved on to also attacking his wife in the same way. Brix said, when he gets mad, he writes songs about it. God only knows how many times I ended up being the brunt of it, where I never thought I would be. Everyone was paranoid about having songs written about them. It was part of his vengeance. As the 80s progressed, so Mark continued down deeper into his own personal darkness. Brix says, Mark was drinking heavily and he was angry. I suspect by then that he was starting to be unhappy in our marriage. But relationships were never severed in a professional manner. Mark's modus operandi was to psychically torture the victim until they would fuck off. And, inevitably, in January 1990, the two of them split up as well, and Brix quit the Fall for the first time.
I noticed in the 90s that what was happening with Mark E. Smith was what had once been sort of almost sympathetically registered in a certain area as the old curmudgeon or whatever, or the old fart, but, you know, what a genius. He suddenly became, you know, a fucking asshole, I guess is the phrase. He suddenly become, you know, not you realise that there was large parts of Mark E. Smith that were not very nice.
I don't think he's made his behaviour any better by his tremendous use of drugs and speedy drugs.
Mark E. Smith, however, was still accumulating personal demons at a hell of a rate, and in 1992, this exchange happened with then drummer Cy Wollstonecroft. Mum passed away at the beginning of October. I didn't have much time to mourn. 2 days later, the Fall had a couple of European gigs. At the sound check, I was more reserved than usual, and I must have looked upset, for which I don't apologise. Mark started shouting at me whilst I sat at my kit. "Just cheer up, you miserable bastard," he said. "Everyone dies. Get over it." To emphasise his point, he pushed over a cymbal stand and attached cymbal, which crashed down on top of me as I sat there astonished. I flew into a rage, possessed, adrenaline coursing. I hurdled the drum kit and waded into Mark with a flurry of haymakers to his head. I couldn't stop. I didn't care about any consequences. Bass player Steve jumped in and eventually pulled me off Mark in the middle of the stage, as all the crew looked on, gobsmacked. "That's a sacking offence, isn't it, Steve?" was all the startled Mark could say, as he staggered off in a daze with a bloody lip. "You started it, Mark," Steve responded tersely. And in 1994, Brix returned to the band, but not to Mark E. Smith. It would be another 2 years later in 1996 when things finally came to a head between those two. In October, 60 people turned up to our show at the concert hall in Motherwell, Scotland. The band was saying Mark was on some OCD thing, washing his hands constantly, speed psychosis, claiming he'd caught a skin disease after shaking hands with a young girl in a wheelchair. He had welts on his arms trying to bite away the sores. During the sound check, Mark threw a mic stand at an engineer and Brix got into a massive row with him, threatening to smash his head in with her 12-string Rickenbacker. Everything is in order until Brix puts her shoulder bag down. Mark takes prompt exception to it and forcefully slings the offending bag into the wings. A cascade of belongings fall out over the stage. Lipsticks, makeup, bottles of pills, packets of tissues, all of them showering down upon us. Bricks grabs her guitar by the neck and threatens to cave his head in with it. I'm willing her to do it. We all are. At this point, more than any other, this tiny woman has harnessed the strength of the entire band. Ring the police, screams Mark. I'm being assaulted by a psychotic American bitch from LA. No one budges. Screaming a torrent of abuse at Bricks, he lunges for her guitar, grabs it off her, and throws that into the wings as well. Fuck you, screams Bricks. I'm out of here for good. And she runs off towards the bar in tears. It's clear she's not joking about leaving. I try to talk her out of it, but she can't get out of here fast enough. A gig at the Assembly Rooms in Worthing shows just how far the artful young Mancunian poet of 20 years ago had now fallen. Marc Smith had insisted that he was going to play guitar at the show, and so a friend of the promoter lent him a semi-acoustic guitar with enormous sentimental value. First song, and Mark picks up the sacred guitar, plays a couple of notes and launches it across the stage. Next, his mic is thrown into the audience, followed by his backup mic. Mark slings an arm around me and drags me off stage. He thinks it's too hot. He grabs a coat from a nearby chair, throws it on and screams at me to get back on stage and play the fucking bass. Back we go as James the roadie is climbing on stage with mics he's managed to retrieve from the audience. Mark throws his mic stand at James like a javelin. James just manages to duck out of its way. Mark is edging close to the front of the stage, and I can see a practical joker at the front feverishly fiddling with Mark's footwear. Braveheart James crawls across the stage with his trusty Stanley knife, aiming to slice the shoelaces and set our frontman free. Mark spies the well-meaning James, twists around and tries to kick him in the face. But because of his bonds, he falls over backwards flat on his arse. Me and drummer Cy lift him up and carry him off into the wings. We aren't going back on, no matter what. The crowd are really pissing me off. There's a hideous vibe in the room. They're loving it, laughing at us. It's like a freak show.
There came a moment when it turned, and that abuse that we'd put down to just him living on the edge and the speed and the booze, it started actually to be something that was really, clearly just affecting him as an individual. That was the moment when you kind of thought, oh my God, what if he wasn't a genius? He was just an old drunken tramp that when he got really drunk started to spout phrases that made a kind of sense, and we read too much into it,
And so, now you know the highlights. Now you know an overview in brief of the background story, which brings us on to the final chapter, the gig itself. In the first half of 1998, The Fall were on tour in America again, and it was in April, at the penultimate show of that tour at a venue called Brownie's in New York City, that everything finally came to a head. Let me introduce you to the cast. Marc Smith on vocals as always. His latest girlfriend, Julia Nagel, was on keys. Relative newbie, Tommy Crooks, was on guitar. And long-standing members Steve Hanley and Carl Burns were on bass and drums. Steve on bass and Carl on drums had been locking horns with and trying to tolerate Marc Smith for many years, and this gig turned out to be the gig that broke the camel's back. Thankfully, that night someone was running a camcorder in the crowd, so, using that footage and various other sources, I'm going to piece together what happened that night and unfold the final scenes of the complete self-destruction of The Fall. The set opens with a song called Spencer Must Die, and you can see the first act of sabotage here, where Mark pulls over one of Carl's cymbal stands right in the first song, leaving a 20-second gap of drum silence before Carl can get back in again. The second song was Masquerade.
And that's not, they're gonna beat me up like the big family are.
It seems Mark was intent on pushing the band, on stage, in the middle of the gig, until they snapped, to judge by what he just said. It's almost as if he was getting some kind of sadistic pleasure out of the whole charade. He then throws his mic stand onto the floor. He then wanders over to the keyboard that his girlfriend is trying to play and just repeatedly mashes his hands down on the keys. The third song, Pearl City, actually passes by without a hitch. But on song 4, Everybody But Myself, Mark E. Smith crouches down in front of the drum riser, his back to the audience, leafing through piles of paper, presumably looking for the lyrics. And he stays there for the full 3.5 minutes of this song. By song 5, which is Hip Priest, the guitars have gone completely out of tune. Once again, Mark starts just mashing his hands on the keyboards mid-song. And then, before the song finishes, for no clear reason, Mark just wanders off stage. He leaves. The band starts song 6, a song called Free Range, but Mark is nowhere to be seen, and you can see he's left the backstage door just a little bit ajar, and there's a crack of light coming through. He's just leaving the band to play on instrumentally and not bothering to even come out. Apparently Mark would regularly just abandon stage mid-gig, leaving the band to play on without him. However, when Mark then wanders back on stage, Carl misses a beat on the drums. And Mark seemingly retaliates to Carl just slightly losing his rhythm by helping himself to all of Carl's spare drumsticks and just throwing them on the stage. Mark's goading, he's stalking around, spoiling for a fight. Under this barrage, we carry on until he grabs the spare drumsticks from the front of the kit. Carl goes berserk. He leaps out and starts hitting Mark. And once he starts, he can't seem to stop. Steve, the bassist, continues, "Stop fucking about and get on with it," I tell Carl, shoving him back. Next, Mark turned on Tommy, the guitarist. Now it's Tommy's turn. As Mark lunges for his guitar, he hasn't accounted for the ever-ready spirit of our Highlander, who promptly gives him a solid kick up the arse.
Listen, this is a remix!
Mark actually apparently broke one of Tommy's strings there. After getting kicked in the arse, Mark vanished backstage again, and a member of the audience who has now got hold of one of the vocal mics started yelling at the band through it.
What? Don't give me this gimmick shit! Fucking what? Don't give me this gimmick shit! Fucking play! Don't give it, man! Get behind the fucking drums and play!
And you can see Tommy yelling back at the audience from his side of the stage too. The band and the audience start yelling "fuck you" at each other.
Shut the fuck up. Everybody shut the fuck up. Yeah. Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up.
And by this time, both Mark E. Smith and Carl the drummer have emerged again, and Mark goes to the mic.
Right guy here is a Scottish man, a fucking animal on drums, and a fucking idiot.
Yeah, no fucking singer, man! Where's the fucking singer? You cock!
I've been assaulted in public here by 2 people, or 3 people. You be witness to me. Bear witness, laddie. They're very big. I tell you what, these three, I got a taxi, and some fucker pulled a gun out on me from fucking Pakistan or someone. But the very thing, these three were cowering in the fucking dressing room, as usual.
And so, the bass amp having been broken by Carl and Mark's brawl, Steve had to move over to the other side of the stage to plug in over there, while Tommy got a new string on his guitar. They tune back up and try to get the gig back on track, but Mark walks off again, leaving them to play the whole song instrumentally once more. I take my lead, walk over to Tommy's side of the stage, plug into his amp and begin to play Levitate. Farce. Mark walks off. After we finish the song, he comes back on and continues his assault. Mark came back on stage for song 8, which was called Lie Dream of a Casino Soul, but immediately took his microphone and whipped Tommy and Steve in the head with it. Tommy fights back and tries to grab the mic off him, but Mark won't let it go and then gets right in Tommy's face. The remainder of that song actually went off without a hitch, but between the end of that one and the start of the next one, Mark was kind of rambling semi-incoherently into the mic.
Well done, lads! End of the song at the right time. Although I give you don't raise your hand to God. Got us, I'm fucking good at it. What a lovely fucking
As the band now start playing song 9, Behind the Counter, Marky Smith wanders over to the new bass amp that Steve Hanley is using and starts twisting and playing with all the dials, completely wrecking his tone. And then, having destroyed his tone, he then pulls the lead out of the amp mid-song. He then goes over and starts slamming on the keyboards again. And then, after the song has finished, he carries on just slamming and slamming, making noise on the keyboards, until the sound engineer just pulls him out of the mix and he kind of loses interest and walks away. And the next song, Heap Hep, is the final one that the whole band ever played together on stage. Halfway through, Mark starts mashing on the keyboards again. And this time, Julia just sits on the floor, seeming to have had enough. And during this, their final song, we at last see in the flesh what the fall always was anyway, underneath the surface, playing out in real life. On one side we see Mark E. Smith and whichever girl he was dating at the time, and on the other side was the entire rest of the band, exhausted, abused and somewhat traumatised. And when that song ended, Mark just continued mashing and mashing on the keyboards, as if he was getting the last word in, while the rest of the band walked off the stage, never to return to it. Tommy, sensibly, took his guitar with him, but bass player Steve made the mistake of leaving his on its stand on the stage. Steve says, "We put our instruments down and charge into the dressing room. We're falling apart and everyone's filming it for the world to see again and again. Mark and Julia try to play Powder Keg, but it's already exploded. I watch from the wings as Mark picks my guitar off its stand. He walks about as if to play it, before dismissively tossing it away like debris beneath his contempt. It might be entertaining to watch, but it's devastating to be part of." What you just saw was Marky Smith throwing Steve's bass into Carl's drums. But they weren't actually Carl's drums, they were borrowed, and Mark knew that. The last song in the set was Powder Keg, but the band didn't return, so Mark performed it solo with Julia in the background at first. But it's a strange, desolate, ghostly moment, and just to underscore the bleakness, halfway through, the sound engineer at the back starts fading up walkout music, as if to say, "The show's over, there's nothing to see here," while Mark Smith is still trying to perform the song.
Town is a powder keg. Radiohead, radioactive, false. I had a dream. 1, 2, 3. Radiohead, active.
The audience called out for more, but the band did not return, and backstage, the band surrounded Marky Smith. "Why did you trash the drum kit?" I demand of him, but he won't say. Mark, the genius wordsmith who's spent 20 years singing his original lyrics over the music, knows the value of words, and how an absence of them can mean more. He won't talk to us, he just looks back at me with that untouchable glare and starts making a series of clicking noises. Stuff said that should have been said years ago. "You're just a bully," I tell him. "The power of the checkbook, that's all you've ever had." A line is being crossed. Any remaining respect from either side is being lost. "I am never getting on stage with you again," I tell him. Steve went back on stage to rescue whatever remained of his bass, and you can see from his interaction with an audience member that he was aware he had just been part of something utterly surreal.
Who's gonna play me in the movie? Sting! Sting! Who's gonna play me in the movie? Sting!
After giving Mark a piece of their minds, the three lads, minus Mark, all went out for a drink to drown their sorrows and handed in their notice permanently for the fall. And then, after the rest of the band had left, Marky Smith finally also turned on his sole remaining ally and was arrested by the New York Police Department for allegedly kicking, punching and choking Julia Nagel, the one remaining band member who still stood by him. There's Mark outside the hotel, whiter than ever, handcuffed in the back of a police car. He asks me to get in the car, but I can't. I won't. I don't care what's happened, what he's done now, or what anyone else has done to him. I don't want to know. We're all supposed to be playing again tonight, but that's not going to happen, so I go to the airport instead. Thankfully, the flight's virtually empty. As the plane heads up over New York, one thing's certain. I'm never going to play bass with The Fall again. It is, of course, easy to listen to a story like this and believe that Marky Smith was nothing but a bastard morning, noon and night. However, of course, that's not true. In some of the various moments not covered by this documentary, there are some nice moments as well. It's not all just bleak, petty evil. After the disastrous gig at Brownie's, Mark would go on once again to recruit another complete replacement band, not for the last time, and he carried on making music up until the time of his death in 2018. Then and only then could The Fall be truly considered to have finally disbanded. And to this day, Marky Smith remains a divisive figure, a flawed genius to some and a sadistic madman to others. Truth be told, he was probably a little bit of both. A massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. If you would be interested in getting access to exclusive bonus content and being thanked at the end of videos, the link to my Patreon is down in the description. I've recently posted a Patreon exclusive video on the most creative chord sequence of 1965, which is not by the Beatles. So click the link in the description and sign up if you'd like to check that one out. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.